Welcome to the fourth and final event in Niagara University's Transformative Visions Presidential Speaker Series for the fall semester. My name is Kevin Hinckley. I teach in the Political Science Department and serve as Director of Niagara's Pre-Law Advisement Program. Transformative Visions was created to host conversations with visionaries who have imagined and struggled to create a just future. The series was imagined and developed by Niagara University's president, Father James Marr, who has challenged us to think deeply about critical issues that receive inadequate treatment in U.S. presidential campaigns. On behalf of my co-organizer, Dr. Dave Riley, and the entire planning committee, we thank Father Marr for envisioning and supporting this series, and we thank all who have contributed to making the series a reality. In the 2020 presidential election, the major party candidates attempted to define the issues and, for better or worse, to offer a vision of how they would seek to transform America and the world. Historically, campaign promises are thwarted, diluted, or ignored, failing in ways large and small to alter the status quo. Increasingly, American presidential campaigns are understood by all participants as vacuous, uninspiring exercises in the manipulation of consumer behavior. And in the contemporary entertainment, media, technology complex, the ideals of equality, reasoned deliberation, and participatory democracy are sacrificed on the altar of corporate greed. As Election Day neared, we saw and heard bold statements about the defining issues of our time and the power of the people to chart our future course. We believe that a fundamentally different approach is needed. The challenges facing America and the world are complex, magnitudinous, and recalcitrant to simple solutions. Our students, and indeed all persons living today, need the tools to understand racial inequality, police violence, mass incarceration, civil rights, Black Lives Matter, reparations, access to healthcare, inequities in health outcomes, the COVID-19 pandemic, environmental degradation, catastrophic climate change, the global refugee crisis, immigration, the sexual assault pandemic, sexual harassment, #MeToo, LGBTQ discrimination, and so many more. The Transformative Visions series is intended to offer our students a model of inquiry, discourse, imagination, and action. So far this fall, we've hosted conversations with Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick, president of Howard University, surgeon scholar, and national expert in racial disparities in healthcare. We've also hosted Dennis McDonough, former White House Chief of Staff for President Barack Obama and Deputy National Security Advisor. And Dina Gilio Whitaker, award-winning journalist, writer, and educator on environmental justice and Indigenous rights. We are honored and delighted to welcome tonight's speaker, Soffiyah Elijah, who you'll hear from in just a moment. But first, it is my honor to recognize Niagara University alumna Stevie Vargas, who will be introducing Ms. Elijah. In 2016, Stevie earned her Bachelor of Arts from Niagara in Political Science and International Studies. Stevie currently serves as the Upstate Campaign Coordinator for the Alliance for Quality Education. For 20 years, AQE has been leading statewide advocacy in New York, fighting for educational equity for Black and Brown children, immigrants, and children living in poverty across the state. Previously, Stevie served as a community organizer for Citizen Action of New York, a grassroots organization focused on racial justice, education equity, ending mass incarceration, and more. Stevie achieved so much during her time at Niagara University, and it is amazing to see how much she's accomplished in her work as a community organizer and advocate for justice. Stevie?
Thank you for that so much. Well, in 2016, I graduated from Niagara University. And to put it lightly, it was my hope that I would take everything that I learned from this institution and make any community I served an equitable one for those who have been disenfranchised by the current systems that are in place. It has been 4 years since I graduated, and though I may not see these systems dismantled or completely changed in my lifetime, I know that I'm continuing the work of those who came before me and making it a tad bit easier for those who will come after me. So I'm deeply honored to introduce our speaker for tonight, Ms. Soffiyah Elijah, whose incredible career spans more than 20 years. Ms. Elijah is currently the Executive Director of Alliance of Families for Justice, doing incredible work to support families of incarcerated people and people with criminal records, empowering them as advocates and mobilizing them to marshal their voting power to achieve systemic change. Honored by the Massachusetts chapter of the National Lawyers Guild, Ms. Elijah has dedicated her life to human rights and social activism. Recognized both nationally and internationally as an authority on human rights issues, she has served as a justice on several people's tribunals focused on the US government's response to Hurricane Katrina, the testing of bombs in Vieques, Puerto Rico, and conditions of solitary confinement in American prisons. I'd be remiss not to highlight that prior to this role, Ms. Elijah served as the executive director and clinical instructor for the Correctional Association of New York, making history as the first Black woman and woman of color to do so in the organization's 170 years of existence. Prior to joining the staff of the Correctional Association in March of 2011, Ms. Elijah served as deputy director and a clinical instructor at the Criminal Justice Institute at Harvard Law School. At the Institute, she trained hundreds of law students to become effective and ethical lawyers to engage in local and national reform of criminal and juvenile justice policies. Ms. Elijah has an extensive resume, but in all of this, she has dedicated her life to human rights and social justice while being a frequent presenter at national and international forums on criminal justice policy and human rights issues. So please join us in welcoming Ms. Elijah.
Well, good evening, and thank you so much for inviting me to present. I must admit that as I was reflecting on the fact that this is called the presidential series, how timely and I guess a double entendre that we experience what we have been experiencing over the past, what's about a week and a half or so now? I don't know, it seems like an eternity. And still we don't have, I don't think we yet have an acceptance of transition. Nonetheless, I do believe that the people will make sure that transition happens. I am honored to be your presenter this evening, and I hope that you will take away something to reflect on during my comments. I will start by saying that this conversation couldn't be more timely, because as we reflect on the election and the aftermath, we must remember that over the past, what is it, about 10 years or so now, we've heard over and over again that there are 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. That conversation really hasn't discussed much at all about the majority of the 2.2 million people aren't able to vote. And the conversation certainly hasn't expanded to reflect upon the sober reality that research has shown that family members who have incarcerated loved ones are the least likely to be civically engaged, which means in addition to those 2.2 million people behind bars who aren't able to exercise their franchise, the majority of their family members and loved ones similarly are not exercising the franchise, which results in a huge swatch of the American public not being recognized, but definitely being marginalized and not being part of the democratic process. As we forward thinking, and I like to think of myself as being progressive, we forward thinking people reflect on what the future should look like. we cannot honestly think that we can build a better world unless we embrace the reality that we must restore the franchise to people who are incarcerated. There is no reason for someone to lose that fundamental citizenship right because they have been incarcerated. No reason at all. I would say no good, moral, and honest reason. Of course, if we look at the numerous efforts to disenfranchise people, primarily Black and brown people, we can understand that the history of efforts to disenfranchise those groups in this country are tied to racism, attempts to hold on to power, and to marginalize and oppress and repress groups of people based on the amount of melanin in their skin. So as we move together to build a better world, we have to squarely confront the reality that felony disenfranchisement and racism go hand in hand. A lot of other isms and obias also are involved, but I'm focusing in specific on the criminal and justice system because it is so intricately tied to racism in this country. A conversation which I'm heartened to see seems to be opening up in broad ways. I remember a few years ago when the phrase Black Lives Matter first came onto the national scene, and it was deemed to be revolutionary, divisive, negative, all kinds of negative connotations were attached to it. But thankfully, the BLM organizers did not back down. I remember them organizing a lie down on the street here in Harlem, where, not far from where our office is located, in front of the state office building. And a number of people laid down on the plaza in front of the state office building to call attention to what had happened to then Eric Garner, who had been strangled by police in Staten Island, one of the 5 boroughs from New York City. And I remember lying down on this street and saying, I wonder if one day this small act can be combined with so many others to make a difference. And I wonder if one day we can stop demonizing the very simple phrase, Black Lives Matter. I could not have imagined that fast forward to 2020, that reality would have come to pass. And now you have all kinds of corporate entities and everybody in between shouting proudly, Black Lives Matter. You see it painted all over the streets, and certainly it's more than overdue for us to recognize that simple fact. And I hope that the importance of that reality is never lost on well-meaning people in this country. But let's talk about what's happening in New York State. Certainly in New York, we've witnessed a huge decrease in the prison population. The population has gone down from 72,000 at its height to hovering around 35,000 now. So significant decrease. Interestingly enough, although 13 prisons have been closed, the percentage of prisons that have been closed have not kept step with the significant drop in the prison population. And certainly the significant security staff that's been hired to work in those prisons has not enjoyed a decrease in staffing that keeps step with the decrease in the population. And that is tied in large measure to the reality that the prisons in New York State, as I know most of my friends and colleagues in the Western region and the northern part of the country know, the overwhelming majority of the prisons in this state are located upstate New York. And most of them are in rural areas where they provide a significant source of economic stability for the surrounding area. At the same time that those prisons provide that economic stability, the people who are incarcerated in those prisons, for the most part, come from downstate, from communities that are economically deprived. So the people out of communities in downstate are providing economic stability for people upstate. It is my hope and as part of the effort of the Alliance of Families for Justice, which I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment, that we will engage in a serious effort to build sustainable economic sources for our upstate brothers and sisters that are not dependent on the misery of their downstate brothers and sisters. I think that if we're able to put people on the moon and launch space shuttles, we can solve more basic problems like economic stability and community revitalization throughout our state. In New York and in most states across the country, people who are incarcerated are not allowed to vote. In April of before I go to that, I should say, in a significant number of states, also people on parole are not allowed to vote. In April of 2018, that changed in New York State due to an executive order signed by Governor Cuomo. He said in that executive order that he was going to exercise his executive power for the limited purpose of granting conditional pardons to people who are on parole so that they could register to vote. This was very significant in New York. There's over 36,000 people who are on parole. And this provided access to the franchise for people who otherwise would not be allowed to vote. Efforts to codify that executive order and make it a statute that will not be contingent upon who is occupying the governor's mansion have been challenged significantly by conservative legislators in this state, by law enforcement groups coming together to challenge the franchise for people who are incarcerated and people who are on parole. This is a thinly veiled racist attempt to continue to marginalize communities that have been overly policed and overly impacted by mass incarceration in this state. Part of the work of the Alliance of Families for Justice involves trying to overturn that reality and to restore the right to vote to people who are incarcerated and codify the right to vote for people who are on parole. Alliance of Families for Justice is a nonprofit statewide organization headquartered in Harlem, and our mission is to support, empower, and mobilize families who have incarcerated loved ones and people who have a criminal record. With the onset of the pandemic in March of this year, all of our operations pivoted quickly to functioning on a virtual platform. Prior to that, our legal support unit, comprised of 2 attorneys and a law clerk, traveled all over the state, meeting with their clients, and their focus of their work was primarily on the conditions under which people were incarcerated and disciplinary measures that were taken against them that didn't rise to the threshold level for the Prisoners Legal Services, which is a small organization that has only enough funding to handle the most egregious cases. So the Alliance of Families for Justice Legal Support Unit is able to handle and represent people in the also problematic but less egregious matters that the Prisoners Legal Services is unable to handle. We also have a family support unit that provides counseling services on a group level, family level, and one-on-one. We also provide healing retreats, family healing retreats on an annual basis, in addition to something that we created called Supportive Voices, which is an operation where family members reach out to other directly impacted family members to provide more one-on-one listening and support on a weekly basis. In addition to those things, we also provide advocacy skills training and communication skills training so that our family members and formerly incarcerated people are not window dressing for the efforts and campaigns that are pursued by the organization, but they are the architects of those campaigns and the implementers of those campaigns. One of the campaigns that we have moving in full steam right now is one that's focusing on visits and visitation inside the state's prisons. When the pandemic hit hard in March of this year, visits in the prisons were suspended. They remained suspended until August. During that suspension, unfortunately, the Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, known as DOCS, did not implement any kind of comprehensive plan to provide for the safety and well-being of incarcerated people. It also didn't provide for a comprehensive plan for the safety and well-being of its staff. It also did not implement any kind of routine testing for people who were incarcerated. So for many months, we had no way of knowing to what degree the pandemic, in fact, was present inside the state's prisons. Within the past couple of months, DOCS has started to test the incarcerated population. And so you've seen numerous reports in the media that the numbers inside the prisons have spiked. What you don't hear in the media is that the comparison is the test results that are being generated now compared to no test results over the March, April, and May, and June months. So we don't know how the numbers that we have today compared to what the percentage of infection was back in the spring and the onset of the pandemic. So the Alliance of Families for Justice has organized family members to bring pressure on the governor and the commissioner of DOCS to, one, implement a comprehensive plan to protect the health of our loved ones, two, to provide for quality and safe visitation for family members with their loved ones. One of the reasons that this is so important is that all the research has shown that strong family and community ties are one of the key factors for successful reentry into society. The longer those ties are cut off because there's no visits, there's no in-person communication, the less likely someone is to maintain strong ties and to be successful when they come back into the community. That will ultimately result in more problems for us as a society. We believe that it is possible, and we know that it is possible, to provide for safe and quality visits while also providing for the health and safety of everybody involved. So in addition to our campaign to restore safe and quality visits, we're also pressuring the governor and DOCS to restore the processing of marriage applications. Since March, no marriage applications have been processed by DOCS. The excuse is that it's tied to COVID, but it's lost on me, and I would imagine lost on most of you, as to how processing marriage license applications could have any negative impact on the numbers of people infected with the virus inside the prisons. We also are pressing to have the family reunion program re-implemented so that families who had been used to coming and spending a weekend with their loved ones inside could continue to do so. Everybody who visits a prison has to go through a COVID-19 screening test, so they're not allowed to come inside the facility. So it would seem that with those kinds of precautions, there's no reason not to restore the family reunion program, not to restore the processing of marriage license applications, and not to restore full and quality visits so that family bonds can be strengthened, ensuring more successful reentry for people who are incarcerated. Another significant part of our work is to build leadership skills in the family members who are involved in our organization and who just come to us because they're in need of support. All of our services are free. Every single thing that we do, from the legal support, family support, the retreats, etc. And people can engage with us as much or as little as they wish. There's no quid pro quo. If someone needs legal representation for their loved one, we ask nothing of them other than to provide us with the details of the case so that our lawyers can get involved. If someone is in need of counseling, we ask for the same details so that our licensed social worker can get involved with that family and help them navigate the challenges that they are confronting. Our staff and our board members are all comprised of directly impacted people. Either they are formerly incarcerated themselves or they have or had an incarcerated loved one. So we don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk. We know firsthand what it means to have an incarcerated loved one, what it means to suffer the stigma and the silence, and what it means to find similarly situated people who can understand and appreciate the challenges that you and your family are confronting and work together to build solutions that are more supportive of people and not designed to destroy families and communities. Because we know that strong and healthy families result in strong and healthy communities. And by creating strong and healthy communities, we build a stronger nation and a stronger democracy. And that ultimately is what we want to see for everyone. It is our hope that by empowering family members and their loved ones, that they can be part of the narrative, part of the discussion, part of the policy decisions. Our family members go on the radio, they do panel discussions, they've been interviewed on television, they have had op-ed pieces published in the major newspapers throughout the greater metropolitan area. They also have met with elected officials in the state legislature to talk with them about the importance of restoring the right to vote for people who are incarcerated. Excuse me 1 second. Let's see if I can stop that. My apologies. So that's some of the work that we have been involved in, and it has produced a whole host of new leaders in our community that are experiencing for the first time the opportunity to really be part of the solution and not talked about, but at the decision-making table. And we're convinced that by doing this and empowering the people who are most directly impacted by these systems that have been destroying their communities, we can build fundamental change that will benefit all of us in the long run. I'm going to pause now and see if it's a good time to start to take some questions. And Kevin, perhaps you can help me with that.
Certainly, certainly. So I'll ask the first question and then invite students and attendees who have questions. We will open your mic and promote you to the panel to ask those questions. So on this question of fundamental change, and you described some of the political forces and the economic forces that are at play in New York State. The late Harvard Law School professor, William Stuntz, argued that the politics of criminal law in America are deeply pathological. According to Professor Stuntz, political and institutional incentives had created a one-way ratchet in favor of ever broader criminal liability rules and ever harsher sentences. And when Professor Stuntz was writing, he observed that this dynamic didn't seem to depend on which political party was in control. That criminal law, he said, seems to expand as much and as fast under Democrats as under Republicans. So I was curious, do you see evidence suggesting that the long-term trends that Professor Stuntz observed may be changing?
And so, first of all, I love the question. But I want to address it from this standpoint. Part of the problem that any of us who seek to change, fundamentally change this system that we confront is that there's an addiction problem in America. There's a very significant addiction problem. And I'm not talking about opioids or marijuana. We have an addiction to punishment, right? As a society, there's some kind of very sick rush that seem to get at the idea of inflicting more and more pain and punishment on the people or the individual that we have deemed to be the wrongdoer. Okay. We don't seem to be comfortable enough with the fact that there are people who wear black robes, who sit on benches a little bit higher than the rest of the people in courtrooms, who have been deemed to have the power to mete out punishment and sentences. And they actually are the only people in our society who we have, at least on paper, acknowledge have the right to sentence people to punishment. And the punishment is only to take away someone's liberty. However, inside of our prisons and jails, people are subjected to all kinds of human indignities, which we as a society have accepted as being, quote unquote, the norm. The very disturbing phrase of if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime, seems to be our very callous response to the mistreatment of human beings behind bars. And that's all tied to this very disturbed comfort level that we have with inflicting more and more punishment. So in order to bring about fundamental change in the criminal law system, I think it's fair to say that the criminal law system is indeed criminal. We have to challenge this addiction and take drastic measures to rehabilitate our society, to get it off of this drug called punishment. We need to accept and really accept and embrace that in norms of, say, child rearing and other settings, we use positive reinforcement as the way to modify human behavior. And part of the reason that I think as a society we've gotten so comfortable with this addiction to punishment is that people being punished more and more are Black and brown, because we've moved from we've moved from the days of slavery where Black and brown people didn't even get into a courtroom. They went straight to the whipping post or the lynching tree. So part of this addiction to punishment has to do with the otherization of people deemed to be different from. So one of the things that I'm encouraged by is that as people have taken to the streets in the aftermath of the horrific murder of George Floyd in real time for all of the world to see, more and more people are speaking out about this reality of the intersection of racism, criminal law, criminal injustice, and mass incarceration.
Thank you. We have our first student question, Christian Farkas.
Okay.
Christian, we will make you a panelist and invite you to pose your question. Christian, go right ahead.
You hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. My question is, what you see the greatest obstacle to prison reform as you see it?
What is the greatest obstacle to prison reform? Well, first I would say, Christian, after over 4 decades of working in this field, I actually don't think that the prison system can be reformed. I think we've gone too far down the rabbit hole to reform it, and it needs a complete and total overhaul. I don't think we can reform the prison system any more than we could reform slavery. The obstacle is this notion, it's a very disturbing notion that we feel a certain degree of comfort in the pain and suffering of other human beings, that we don't accept or recognize or structure our courts or even the prisons as a place to provide an opportunity for people to genuinely rehabilitate and get whatever services they need. We don't, with any degree of determination, build a society that provides an opportunity for all people, regardless of the color of their skin, to have a fair chance to realize their dreams. I grew up in a community where just a few blocks away, it was very clear that you shouldn't ride your bicycle past that block. You shouldn't walk past that block. You shouldn't be caught on that, across that street after dark as a Black person, because literally you were not physically safe. And certainly the provision of educational services in the community that I lived in was very, very subpar compared to the children who live just a few blocks away. Those kinds of inequities are the reality across this country. And as a society, we have to be willing to unearth that in every way possible. Housing, education, health provisions, and policing. All of those systems require huge overhauls. And when it comes to the prison system, as I said before, and at the risk of being redundant, I think we've gone so far that it can't be reformed. Reform means chiseling away at the edges. This is not a system that we can afford to chisel away at the edges. I say that a chisel's not the tool. We're more into the jackhammer department. Okay.
Thank you. Our next student question from a student in a course that I'm co-teaching with Dr. Riley and Professor Pickering, organizing and advocating for justice. Casey Brown. Casey, you're up.
Okay, hello. So, in our class, we've talked a lot about getting at the root of the problem and not just like fighting against like certain injustices or like certain issues, but the whole problem and hitting it head on. And so I know that one of your big issues is mass incarceration, and I've talked about that in our class, in my criminal justice class, and a lot of other classes because it's an important issue. So I guess my question for you is, what do you believe the root of this problem, mass incarceration, what do you believe it is, and what do you think fosters like mass incarceration? Why do you think that it's still here today? Why do you think we want it and why it exists? And how do we go about fighting that?
Okay, it's a good question, Casey. And as I want to say, Christian, your question also was an excellent question. So the root problem, Casey, is not tied just to the criminal and justice system, right? I would say that the root problem is, as a society, we have not built a society where the needs of the people are the central focal point and important priority for government and everything that we do in our society. We're driven primarily by money, so profit always takes the lead over people. If we learn nothing else during this horrific pandemic and the thousands and thousands of lives that have been lost, economics certainly played a major role in that reality. So in our effort to build a more just and humane society, we have to unearth the fact that we have not crafted a society that centers the needs of the people. And until we do that, we're going to find inequities and problems in any system that we look at. So the mass incarceration in the criminal justice system is just one manifestation of the fact that we have failed to center people. Our homelessness problem certainly is another manifestation. The fact that we lag behind many, many other countries across the globe in education, healthcare, housing, all of those. Don't let me get started about climate change, okay? So we have not centered people. If we centered people, we could fix probably 90% of what of the problems on your bucket list, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next, we will turn to our provost and a teacher scholar in criminology and criminal justice, Dr. Tim Ireland.
Okay.
Did I do this right? Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. How are you this evening?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm a little tired, my friend. It's been a really weird semester for us.
I can well imagine.
I got a quick question for you. I spent a lot of time when I was a lot younger kind of thinking about the the whole back end of the system, so post-conviction. And one of the things that, and kind of building off a comment you made earlier this evening about the kind of the shift of economics from community A to community B. And I have the sneaking suspicion that if you are incarcerated in County A during a census year like this year, you are counted in the county where you're incarcerated, and you are not counted in the county from where you come from. Is that true?
That way. It used to be that way.
Okay, it used to be that way?
It changed in, was that 2010? It changed, and so now, for purposes of the census, you're counted in the county of origin, where you were domiciled before you were incarcerated.
And could you talk a little bit about why that change came about, or what your understanding of the importance of a change like that?
Certainly. So for your students and the listening audience, let me elaborate a little bit. So up until 2010, people who were incarcerated were counted for census purposes in the county where they were incarcerated. And the reason that that was so significant is because those numbers reflected how resources, tax dollars, were going to be distributed and services were going to be distributed to various communities. So areas where people were incarcerated were getting a disproportionate slice of the pie, but the slice that they were getting was not being evenly distributed amongst all the people who were counted in that county, because the people who were incarcerated weren't getting any benefits from those tax dollars, and the communities from which they came were showing up with a smaller slice of the pie, okay? And those communities were not getting the benefits that they should have gotten based on the number of people who actually came from that county. And that was the norm for a very long time. As I said, it's only 10 years ago that this changed. And it was the result of a lot of advocacy work and a real peeling of the onion about the inequities that were resulting from that just wrong approach towards census counting. There's no other, there's no professional word that I can think of better than wrong, okay? So I hope that really addressed the question that you were, and the point.
And so I'll just say, because I moved out of the academic realm about 8 years ago, it's been tough to keep up on changes like this, but it is a little shocking that it's only one census, right? It's only been in one census where those were able to advocate for a change in legislation to make sure that the resources go right to the home county and not to the incarceration county, right? So thanks for that. I really appreciate it.
One of the things that effort highlighted for me, and I have to say, when I was much, much younger, I would hear what I would call my elders at the time saying, if you want to be in this work, you have to be prepared for protracted struggle. I didn't really know what the word protracted meant, but it sounded like something I didn't want to do. I wanted things to change, if not tomorrow, the day after tomorrow. I had no idea that it meant like a lifetime. So I guess some might say that 10 years isn't too bad, but way too long to wait for a change as significant as that.
Our next question from Bella Ayu, a student in organizing and advocating for justice and a member of the Justice Houses Living Learning community on campus. Bella.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if I could ask you, in your opinion, if people in prison had the right to participate in the political process, if maybe legislators would start to view the prisons themselves as like a real voting bloc, and maybe even start to improve the conditions of confinement. And I know that complete reformation isn't really possible, especially not right away, but would this be an effective first step? And what would be the first steps to advocating for at least this small piece of it?
Well, again, I love the question. And I think we have some basis to believe that people who are incarcerated would vote primarily liberally, okay? We have found over the past 2 years, Alliance of Families for Justice met one-on-one with virtually every member of the state Senate and Assembly to talk to them about the fact that we thought that the franchise should be restored for people who are incarcerated, because we were doing a litmus test. We were trying to get a sense of how much opposition we would get and how much support we would get, and how to shape our narrative to reach what I call the movable middle and dodge the recalcitrants, right? So in the process of that work, we encountered some elected officials who we actually thought were going to be kind of conservative, who immediately embraced the idea and wanted to know if they could call upon us to help with crafting ways to go inside the facilities and campaign. They wanted how they could get their literature inside, if they could go inside and hold, candidate debates, etc. So we encountered a broad spectrum of views from elected officials. I do think that for those elected officials who really embraced the idea, they understood that this was a constituency that had been ignored and that they should really reach out to and engage in the process. Similarly, some of those who opposed us understood the same thing. And that's part of the reason they were so committed to making sure that the vote was not restored to that same population. We would tell them to look at examples like Maine and Vermont and Puerto Rico, where people who are incarcerated are able to vote, and clearly the sky didn't fall with the incarcerated population being able to vote, and that it was time, far beyond time, for New York State to claim the leadership role that it says that it holds in this country and be on the front lines of bringing and building real meaningful force to the phrase that citizenship and civic engagement really means something for building a strong democracy. So I hope that that addressed some of your question. If it didn't, please feel free to follow up with a backup question.
No, thank you so much.
Okay.
Our next question from another student in our course and in the Justice Houses, Sam Delacqua.
Okay.
Hello.
Sam.
So the question I had was like how you go about building up like a big organization like the Alliance of Families for Justice, and like, yeah.
Okay. All right, I'll give you a little bit of that history. And I will tell you this, some of my friends, when I told them that I was going to start a nonprofit organization from scratch, told me that I had absolutely lost my mind. Okay. Fortunately, I didn't listen to them, and I plowed forward. The first 15 months, I worked with no pay. Okay. So I lived off of my savings. I depleted my savings. I got really good at meditation and prayer. And one day we got a call from some folks who had been watching the work that we were doing. It was a law firm, a major law firm, and they asked if we could use a donation of $100,000. And I almost collapsed on 125th Street here in Harlem, because that made all the difference in the world. It enabled us to pay our rent and to start to think about creating salaries for our staff, all of whom were volunteer at the time. Also, I would say the mission of Alliance of Families for Justice is shaped around a real need, right? There was a real gap. There were no organizations crafted to do what we do. That doesn't mean there weren't support groups, but the holistic approach that we take that addresses first the needs and the suffering that people have, and then providing them with the skills tools that they need to be voices and advocates in their own right, and in providing them with the opportunities to be at the table and shape decisions and policy, that theory of change hadn't existed before. And I'd spent many years studying what happened and what had been happening in the advocacy community, and how the nonprofit industrial complex had evolved into something that depended on people's dependency and wasn't providing meaningful leadership opportunities for the people who were most impacted by the systems that needed to be changed. And so this organization was almost ordained to succeed because it was so desperately needed. It's not a theory of change or an approach that has to be sold to the people who benefit from it. As soon as people hear about it, they gravitate to it. If you have or have had an incarcerated loved one, or been incarcerated yourselves, or currently incarcerated, the word has flown around like wildfire that we exist. Our challenge is, how do we address the needs of 35,000 plus incarcerated people and their family members? I heard you say, how do you build a large organization? Well, we're not actually that big, okay? We have 5 full-time people and 5 part-time people. That's it. And 2 of those full-time people in the legal support unit, okay? Then you have myself, our development director, and 1 other person. We just launched our youth empowerment project that focuses on youth between ages of 16 and 24. And the project coordinator is a full-time person. So that just is what took us to our 5 full-time people. Okay. So we're growing incrementally.
A barrier to franchising incarcerated people? And also, what are some of the best methods of achieving economic justice despite this kind of difficulty?
Okay, let's start with your first question, and I'll probably ask you to repeat the second one, okay?
No problem. Thank you so much.
So your question takes me to an answer that I was providing a little while ago when I was saying it's important for us to center people. Right? Unfortunately, a capitalist system requires that someone's on the top and someone's on the bottom. And when you grow up in a capitalist society and then you raise children in this capitalist society, and they raise children in a capitalist society, and it keeps going, you forget to question this idea that someone has to be on the top and someone has to be on the bottom in order for that system to thrive. And I say the system to thrive, not the people to thrive, right? So if you really dig into what is required to create a system where the people thrive, then you will quickly realize that capitalism can't provide that. It will provide an opportunity for some people to thrive until they get sick, or they have an accident, right? Or someone in the family is suffering from mental health challenges and inadequate insurance or finances to provide adequate care, and things start to go sideways fairly quickly, because those scenarios occur in a society that hasn't centered people. So I am a firm believer that we have to build a system that does center people, that allows people's dreams to be realized and meets the fundamental needs of all of the residents in that society. If we don't do that, I think we're destined to fail. So now that I waxed eloquently a little bit on your first question, maybe you can repeat your second question so that I can make sure that I respond to it as well.
Absolutely, and I thank you again, and I think you've already really touched on it quite a bit. But I think my follow-up question is just for those of us who are, really hoping to kind of support that ideal that you've just laid out, and who are curious and some of your strategies maybe where you've been able to sort of find justice for people despite this difficulty of living in a capitalist society. What would you say are some of the best kind of methods for circumventing that and for achieving goals anyway?
I think the very first thing that we have to do is think outside the box. Okay, now, it's very hard to think outside the box when all you know is the box. Okay, so we have to study other systems that probably aren't functioning here within the United States, and look and see what's happening in other countries around the globe. Because just because we live under the red, white, and blue does not mean we have all the answers. So challenging American arrogance and ignorance is a very important part of being open to studying what's happening in other parts of the world and examining whether or not it's possible to build a better world, learning from other people. It's an interesting reality that the United States, on the global scale, is a fairly young country, but we tend to behave like toddlers oftentimes. I'm not reflecting on the occupant of the White House currently. I'm talking about, as in general, how we've shown up in the world for a long time, not respecting other people's, other cultures, other governments, other government leaders, autonomy of other governments in other countries. We seem to have a hard time for providing just mutual respect for those things. And if we had the trickle-down effect that could come from a statesperson in the leadership position who reflected that kind of respect, hopefully, as a society, an American society, the people would start to conform their vision and their behavior to respect other societies, other cultures, and realize it's possible to learn something from someone who doesn't live in America.
Thank you so much.
Now we will turn back to Stevie for a question.
These questions are giving me so much life right now. I'm like so excited. Full disclosure to attendees, like I'll be upfront, I'm an abolitionist. Like that's what I do, that's what I strive for. So my question is rooted in that thinking. Here, at least here in Rochester, and I would suspect nationally as well, we can see that our police force and our prisons do not service public safety. They service capitalism. And some things that come to mind are for-profit prisons. I think of court fees that people who are in the carceral system accrue. I think of when you go visit a loved one and you're giving them commissary and half of the money that you put in is deducted because of transportation fees, court fees, and all of these other things. And it perpetuates not only a cycle of harm, but also a cycle of poverty for people who are already economically disadvantaged. So our courts, our prisons, and our law enforcement agencies have worked to perpetuate this cycle of harm in our communities. Yet local budgets allocate a majority of their budget to law enforcement in the name of public safety, while ignoring the services that are chronically underfunded that would bring about public safety. I think of mental health providers, I think of equitable housing, I think of education, all these things that get to the systemic cause of police calls. You think of when police are called, they're called because they are enforcing an eviction, they're responding to drug overdose, they're responding to mental health crises, they're responding to crimes, poverty-based crimes. Nothing that they have the tools to solve, but they do have the tools to punish for. So with this, we see a massive call to defund the police, which I'm so here for, and to reallocate those funds to services that would get to this, to root cause of harm or root cause of disparities that we see in our communities. In your opinion, if we succeed or when we succeed in defunding the police, where should we best focus reallocating those funds to bring about true equity to our communities?
Well, Stevie, let me start with, I love the question. Right. I'm also an abolitionist. I've been an abolitionist long before anybody dared to say it. Okay. So I'm happy that, you know, we abolitionists can come out of the closet. But I'm equally a realist. And I'm very clear that this is back to my protracted struggle pain, that in order to get to a place where abolition has some real traction in the society, it will require a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing, door knocking, shoulder rubbing, hard, difficult conversations, particularly in communities that have been over-policed for a long time. And although I am an advocate and a believer in defunding the police, I would say when all is said and done, actually the police are not the issue. Okay, and I know that's going to sound kind of strange. I say police are not the issue because the police only get to be in that posture because we as a society have been lazy about addressing our failures. And we call the police as the default solution to everything. Someone needs mental health care. Someone doesn't have the money to ride the train, so they hop the turnstile. Any of those things, we think that we as a society have said, oh, the solution is to call the police. The police are in the business of keeping themselves employed. So they readily respond to the call, and we never check ourselves and say, wait a minute, actually, we don't need the police for the following 20 things that we call them for, right? We don't need the police in the schools. There's a lot of places we don't need the police. I don't need to walk into a hospital and the first person that I see is a cop, right? I actually need to see a doctor or a nurse, right? That's why I went to the hospital, because I have a health problem. So defunding the police is obviously part of the solution. It's certainly a very attractive rally call, but it is a smaller part of a much larger problem. And I think it goes back to the questions that a couple of other people raised about how do we build a different kind of society and what's the role of capitalism. The police should really become just a functionary of our laziness, for want of a better word. If we centered people and said we are going to use the brilliance and the resources and the knowledge of all the people whose lives are impacted by these systems, because most of the time it is true, it's a little bit cliche-ish, but I have to say it, generally the people closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And that, by and large, is not people who wear blue uniforms, or I don't know what color the uniforms they're wearing in some other communities, but generally, the folks who are armed with guns and generally don't have any sensitivity to the people that they are policing. But part of the reason that I am saying what I'm saying is that we have not, as a society, made the police accountable. And when I say made the police accountable, I'm not talking about after the fact, okay? So I'm going to talk for a moment, I'm going to stretch the imaginations of the folks who are listening. I've done quite a bit of research on the criminal justice system in Cuba, because I think it is a fascinating and very different approach, clearly one that exists in a socialist or communist country where the people's needs are centered. And one of the things that grabbed my undivided attention early on was that in Cuba, you don't get to be a police officer in any community other than the one in which you live, number one. Number two, you don't get to be a police officer unless you are vetted by the community where you live and where you're going to work. So they don't have a police brutality problem because you're not likely to be beating up on your neighbor's son or putting your knee on your neighbor's son's neck or breaking into the home of your neighbor's daughter while they're sleeping and firing away. So police brutality is not an issue in Cuba. And I am not a neophyte who's done, the classic American approach of, I've traveled there 2 times and so now I'm an expert. I've been to Cuba over 90 times and I have studied extensively all over the country. I've talked to many, 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 many people on the street in my broken Spanish and their broken English, and no one has said that police brutality is an issue in the country. And I am a firm believer that part of the reason is because of the way they approach policing. So it's not that the police themselves are the issue. It's what we have been exposed to for so many decades in the United States only has created the police as a nightmare for primarily Black and brown people and to a growing degree progressive white people in this country, right? But that's why I said the police in and of themselves are not the issue, but the way we as a society have decided that we're going to use police. There are roles for police to play, right? If I break down, like if I'm driving down to Malecon and my car breaks down, I want the police to come. The reality, though, in Cuba is before the police get there, a group of community people are going to come and help me fix my car because it's a society that's geared towards how do we all come together to help each other. And that's, I'm hoping, is a mindset and an outlook and a perspective that we can start to build or rebuild in the United States. If you look at the way African socialism existed for hundreds of years, that was the concept. Everybody came together to keep the society healthy and addressed what each person's needs were. You didn't have people homeless and begging in the street. You don't have a homelessness problem in Cuba, and it's one of the poorest countries on the globe because you centered the people. Okay. So I know I veered off a little bit from abolitionists, but I think we can't read an abolitionist agenda in real time unless we take the box that we have been conditioned by and take off all 4 corners and expand our vision to other parts of the world.
Working to reimagine what our society could look like.
Exactly.
Thank you for that so much.
Our next question comes from another student studying organizing and advocating for justice, Ellen Reinisch. Ellen.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been absolutely incredible hearing you answer these questions. And I have a feeling my question also might go to centering people. But my question really is, how do we combat decades or centuries of this otherization of criminals and the narrative that has been really fed through generations? That the carceral state is the only thing that does keep us from sliding into, chaos or, dare I say, anarchy. How do we combat the misinformation that has really been targeted, like a targeted generational propaganda effort, and begin to change minds without compromising, yet again, the end goal of defunding or abolition? Yeah.
Well, I would start with this. Start with examining the language that each of us uses. Okay. So for instance, at AFJ, we don't use the word inmate, offender, convict, felon, any of those terms of endearment that I loathe so much, because we push back against the idea of labeling and objectifying people based on an act that they committed, right? Because we don't ever want to take away their humanity, their personhood. We have no right to take that away or to marginalize that. So that's the first thing. And then I think it's important to study. And when I say study, I mean, yes, you're in a university setting, so I know all the professors are saying, yay, man, I'm so glad you said they should study. I'm talking about study beyond, to study what's been written before, study movements from before, study what has been accepted as your own norms. Sometimes it creates a lot of discomfort amongst families. I've heard a number of young people say, thank God the pandemic has come. I don't have to go through Thanksgiving with my conservative right-wing family members this year. Okay, you know, some of them are praying for next year to be more of the same, just to avoid that reality. But I think your generation has an amazing opportunity right now to challenge every accepted norm that feeds the status quo, right? Every accepted norm. And to dream big about, if you're a person of privilege, and I'm not saying that you are, I'm just saying if you're a person of privilege, to seriously examine how does that privilege show up in so many different ways. Does it show up in the fact, did I go to private school? Did my family, was their idea of exposing me to other cultures taking me on a safari in East Africa, as opposed to helping to really understand the reality of life for the people in that country? Did I get a pass as far as going to a prestigious private school or boarding school? You know, did my parents send me to school with a car because they could afford to, while other people were trying to scrape together car fare, bus fare, right? To understand that, I won't say balance of power, but imbalance of power that comes with money and privilege in this country, and how can you actively challenge the institutions that thrive from that and depend on that. I think those are very fundamental ways to start and to build conversations. Now, I will tell you, sometimes this creates a lot of rift when you're talking to parents, okay? Particularly if your parents will say, and I've had many of my students say this to me, I've struggled all my life to provide this quality of life for you, and the best you can do is turn around and tell me that I'm a fascist pig. I'm not appreciating that right now, okay? So that's probably not the place to start, okay? But, you know, sometimes it's engaging people, if they're fairly locked in their ways, if you can get them to maybe engage in a book club and discussion. Now, I will tell you, I loathe book club discussions. I loathe them. But for people who that's as far as they're going to go at the moment, that's where you engage them. So you have to also be willing to talk to people in person. You know, the idea of organizing via social media, it's got its limitations, because long-term change in society is dependent in large measure about building relationships, right? It's not about how fast you can text or turn out on Instagram or TikTok or whatever the next social media phase is. It's right. It's, have you built connections that are long-term connections with people? So those are some of the fundamental things. We could have an all-day conversation about this, but I'm trying to cram it into just a few minutes for you, okay?
And I so appreciate it. So thank you again.
You're most welcome.
Our next question comes from Tina Schultz, who has been a frequent participant and contributor in our series this semester, which we very much appreciate.
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate that you're here, Dr. Elijah, that you're here to share your infinite experience with us. I participated in a lot of these webinars, mainly because I've just retired in the past 2 years.
I'm jealous.
Yes. Well, one day, keep hope alive. Keep hope alive. I'm more busy now than I was in my 30+ years of in education, and as a social worker, I was 12 years there, and I only recently became involved in these series here because of my work with police reform for New York State, Governor Cuomo's Executive Order 203.
Mm-hmm.
And I decided to be involved in that because there's a need. And I know there was a need in my particular area where I live, where they are extremely conservative and they are voluntarily, they play blind to what is really going on, or they're very resistant to the truth of what is. So I had to make sure that I was there, at least for my own peace of mind. That's at least one person. I know there are many others on the committee, just to make sure that some semblance of truth was at least being discussed. It's, right now, to me, it's a very discouraging venture because of the refusal to accept truth, the refusal to hear, and the blind acceptance of foolishness. So I just I get encouraged, discouraged, but I'm very encouraged by your words of remembering that this is a protracted struggle. So I had that in the back of my head, not those exact words, but I knew the idea was there. But you validated, I guess it's my fear, but my reality, that this is a commitment for a life. It's not just something you do and then go away and leave alone. My question was basically, going back to what you were talking about earlier, where do you think New York State is? Where are we on the timeline of making it a reality as far as allowing those who are incarcerated to vote? Where are we on that continuum?
First of all, thank you so much for your comments. I just wanted to digress for a second about the making about something getting discouraged. I think anyone who seeks to bring about change in the United States can't help but get discouraged sometimes. If you don't get discouraged, then you're kind of functioning in a bubble. If we didn't see anything else last week, we saw ample reason to be discouraged, but also ample reason to be encouraged. If someone had told me that people would stand online in the rain and the cold for 3 to 4 hours to cast their vote in 2020, I wouldn't have believed them. So that is reason to be encouraged. Harriet Tubman's courage is reason to be encouraged. And I believe her DNA filtered through a lot of people and still with us. As far as where are we in the conversation about restoring the right to vote for people who are incarcerated, I actually think we're further along, I know we're further along than AFJ thought we were going to be when we embarked on this effort 2 years ago. And quite frankly, I think this past election, kind of helped us move the needle faster than we had anticipated. That's one thing. I'm going to apologize in advance, but I'm going to use a phrase. Don't worry, I'm not going to say any curse words. I don't want to make our Michaels nervous, but I have a term of art that I use to refer to the current occupant of the White House, and that is Cheeto Head. So that's how I refer to him. If Cheeto Head taught us nothing else, he helped to provide more focus on the importance of as many people as possible exercising the right to vote. And I think that helped to move the narrative. All of a sudden, there was the kind of this flurry of articles in the newspapers, op-eds and mainstream articles talking about why is it that people who are incarcerated can't vote. And I thought, oh my gosh, our time has come. It's been catapulted forward, because I think when people look at the margins of difference in voting, the vote results in different states, they realize that the disenfranchisement of large swatches of the populace. Some places people permanently lose their right to vote, or even in Florida, the right to vote was restored, but if you had fines and fees, you still couldn't vote. So those are all ways to disenfranchise people. Those kinds of things don't exist in New York, but there are others, just the mere fact that you're incarcerated. So I think we are in a golden opportunity right now to push the conversation, because people see what happened in real time. And excuse me, and I shouldn't state it in the past tense, because as I said very early on, we still have not heard that a transition plan is in place, right? As far as I heard this morning, Cheeto Head was still holding on by the nails and not conceding that he's been ousted. So our folks who are inside are ready, willing, and able to vote. And I think will be some of the most informed voters we could ever imagine, because they have the time to study all of the background and the positions taken by the candidates, right? That they're a tremendous source of political information and power for their communities. So I think that we are closer than I would have thought even just 6 months ago. And I can tell you this, I don't plan to rest until we succeed on that one.
Thank you for your information, and thank you for your encouragement. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, keep up the good fight. I know, as you say, you are deep in the belly of the beast.
Yes.
You need to get to know what they had for breakfast, okay?
Yeah. Thank you again.
Our next question comes from Brian Morale. Brian.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So hello, I work in reentry in Niagara County. I am also a student at Niagara University. First of all, I would like to thank you for all your knowledge and insight regarding all these issues in the criminal justice system. And my question is about the Community Supervision Revocation Reform Act. If you're familiar with it, it's also known as the Benjamin Bill or the Less is More. Where
Less is more.
And I just wanted to know if you do know about it, like what is your position and what do you think and how much of a difference do you think it'll make in regards to recidivism in the state?
Okay, but first of all, Brian, I appreciate the question about less is more. I'm quite familiar with it. Some of the organizations that are the architects of Less is More are partners of Alliance of Families for Justice, and we have signed off on numerous petitions and letters in support of that legislation. Whether or not it's geared towards recidivism, I don't think is the primary focus, but the fact that people are being reincarcerated for technical violations of their parole status is extremely problematic. Missing curfew, not reporting a change in job or loss of job or change of employment. There are far less egregious ways to address those things besides putting someone back behind bars. And if we agree that there are very few people who benefit from being held in a cage for any extended period of time, and I think that for me, that's a premise. I've yet to meet the person who says, oh my gosh, I'm so much better because I was caged up for the last 20 years of my life. I haven't met that person yet. So to suggest that that's the response that we should have when someone misses curfew or has a dirty urine is a real problem to me. But again, I don't necessarily tie that to recidivism, because recidivism is kind of accepts that the individual who's on community supervision has failed to successfully navigate the rules under which they're being held, as opposed to has society failed them? Because if their time in what's supposed to be rehabilitation was successful, then when they come home, presumably their likelihood of success should be much higher. And we shouldn't be thinking about ways to reincarcerate them because we didn't provide significant or enough rehabilitation. And I know that probably sounds kind of Peter Pan-ish, and I will readily accept that that sounds kind of Peter Pan-ish. But you know, Peter Pan had an important role to play in our world, and if we don't think kind of Peter Panish sometimes, it's very easy to slip into that addiction that I talked about much earlier, that is fed on punishment. So I think that less is more is a very important piece of legislation that we need to get passed, and that we should do everything possible to keep people out of cages. So
Thank
Brian,
you.
I responded to your question, but if not, please feel free to hit me with a follow-up question.
No, that you responded. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So in just a moment, I'd like to invite our president, Father Marr, to offer a concluding reflection on tonight's talk, conversation, and the fall series. But first, I'd like to ask one last question, and I'd like to add my thanks to all of the students and participants who have thanked you for sharing your experience, your insights, your vision for a more just society. As you have seen, many of the students here want to better understand the issues that you've talked about and the issues that you are working on, and some want to do more than just understand. They want to take action that will make a difference. Some may even want to follow in Stevie's footsteps and yours by devoting their lives and careers to organizing and advocating for justice. So what advice would you offer these students? And in particular, how do you approach translating ideas, translating theory into action?
Oh, well, thank you for that question, because I'm a very action-oriented person, as you probably have surmised by now. I think the first thing is everyone has to decide what they think they can contribute to the effort. So for instance, I could say one of the things that society desperately needs is culturally competent behavioral health professionals. But that may not be your thing. That may not be your calling, right? Maybe your calling is to be a lawyer. Maybe your calling is to be a teacher. The reality is, whatever your calling is, figure out how you can use it in the service of people. That's really what's key. So your calling might be to flip burgers, okay? But you may do something else after you do that job that helps to serve people, okay? Maybe you become a nutritionist and you stop flipping burgers because you decide that you're serving people something that's not healthy for them. Please, I ask the fast food aficionados to forgive me. I'm a vegan. But nonetheless, my point is everybody should get in where they fit in, because there's something for each of us to do. And we don't have to dictate to the next person what that something is. It has to be in their heart. They have to know what it is. For instance, I went to school to be a doctor. I did all the pre-med, everything. I was absolutely going to be the people's pediatrician. How did I end up being a people's lawyer? Because ultimately that was my calling. My calling wasn't to be a pediatrician. And so I used what my calling was to serve the people. I'm sure if I had gone on to be a pediatrician, I'd have figured out a way to use that to serve the people. So that's really what's most important. If we have a vision of building a better world, then there's a piece for each of us to do. Certainly it took a lot of people to create the world that we're living in, one that we're not particularly happy with. So it's going to take at least as many of us to build a better one.
Thank you so much. Father Marr?
Attorney Elijah, I just want to thank you for really a beautiful evening. We see from your life commitment and the work that you've done, it's amazing, but what your spirit, what you convey to people, is what we'll take away as well tonight. So thank you for that and for being with us. Just a final question, if you wouldn't mind. For our students and for our alumni who are working in these fields, I'm often fascinated by asking what sustains you in your work, because I'm sure throughout your life and your commitment, you meet disappointment and you have great struggle. And I think I know what some of the answers may be, but I would love for if you would be able to share with our students who are, and some of our younger alumni who are just starting out on this journey of justice, and what sustains you, what has sustained you in your life and your work and your calling. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Father, and thank you for that question. So what sustains me are a few things. One, I have this insatiable belief that we can win, right? And that's a very important thing, right? I couldn't work this hard. I couldn't get up at 4:30 in the morning. Yeah, I do go to bed by 10, but I couldn't get up at 4:30 in the morning and hit the ground running, starting with the gym, if I didn't believe ultimately that we could win. If I was doing this and I thought there's no chance in the world that we can win, then what, right? I might as well just become a gourmet cook. But, and not that that's a bad thing, but I really do believe that the collective energy of people who are committed to building a better world can build that better world. I really, really do believe that. I can't accept that we won't succeed. It's going to take a lot of time, back to that painful word of protracted struggle. I know that that's a reality, but I have faith that we ultimately are going to succeed. Some might just say, well, it's the good over evil thing, right? And, I could reduce it to that. But I think people who are committed to providing opportunities so that everybody has a fair chance to realize their dreams and breathe free air and live in a healthy environment and care for their children and know that their health needs are provided for. Those are things I think we can strive for. You heard me earlier today reference the fact that I'd been to Cuba many times and studied the criminal justice system. I didn't just study the criminal justice system, I studied the whole way of life of providing for people. And I was struck by the fact that there's no student debt in Cuba. I was struck by the fact that if someone passes away in Cuba, the state pays for the funeral, pays for the casket, pays for the burial. The only thing the family has to provide for is the flowers. We have people and families going into huge debt that they can never dig out of for healthcare and education and housing and burying people. We could change that so that people don't have those kinds of worries, because when you don't have those kinds of worries, then you don't have the kind of stress that creates problems of high blood pressure and all the other things where the body breaks down because the mind's in disarray and trauma. So it's really about the health of the society, not just whether or not the economy is flourishing, but are the people feeling healthy? Do the people have an opportunity to smile and enjoy the coffee and smell the flowers, right? I think we can create that kind of world. And I'm encouraged by the numerous young people who had wonderful questions tonight, that they have an opportunity, and I hate to put this on them, to clean up the mess that the generations that went before them left for them. But they actually don't have a choice. It's the only way we're going to survive. We have to build a better society, because if we don't, we're destined to doom. I don't think there's an argument around that. So what keeps me going? The belief that we're going to win.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I can't think of a more appropriate way to end this semester's list of speakers. And I think really your talk embodies the challenge that was put in front of us to identify ways to encourage the students to think critically about the world around them. And if I might, I may shamelessly steal as a new tagline something that you said tonight: challenge every accepted norm that feeds the status quo. I think that really is a perfect tagline for what it is that we are trying to do in the context of this talk and in a lot of the work that we do throughout at Niagara University, really to make critical thinkers who are capable of elevating the quality of our work for people, in service to people, in whatever it is that we do. So thank you for these inspiring words. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise and your ideas to challenge us and to think about all of this. And I really do hope that the opportunity presents itself that we can bring you to campus when COVID is long gone, and to be able to meet you in person and spend some more time with you, because this is really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I will tell you, David, I'm not coming in the winter.
We'll figure out a summer month or a late spring that would make it work. And you know, we did actually bring students to Cuba a few years back, and maybe we can resurrect that opportunity as well and get you to lead a group of students out there, because it's a wonderful country with great ideas and really gets you thinking in different ways about how the world could be. So thank you.
I used to do that when I was teaching at CUNY Law School, actually.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
So, okay,
Fantastic.
so we'll circle back to that idea.
Sounds great. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Father Marr. Thank you, Stevie, and to all of the students for the wonderful questions. A great way to end this semester's Presidential Transformative Vision Speaker Series. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and we'll look forward to seeing you in the spring.